In moral terms, it does not matter that the government claims to render services vaguely in return for tax payments. If a mugger shines his victim's shoes before absconding with his booty, we don't change our moral judgment of him. He is still a thief. Why? Because unlike the trader in the market, he gives his victim no choice. It's your money or your life. My favorite quote from this great book, Your Money or Your Life, by Sheldon Richman. You can find him at sheldonrichman.com, R-A-R-I-C-H-M-A-N. He's the executive editor at the Libertarian Institute and the chairman at the Center for a Stateless Society. Mr. Richman, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Call me Sheldon. It's been so long since I looked at that book. It didn't sound like me, that quote.
Yeah, well, it's one of my favorites. I love it. As an advocate for a stateless society, the first objection that comes to mind is, but we need laws. What about rapists, murderers, and thieves?
Yeah.
How would we know what the laws are? What would be your response to the objection, but we need laws?
Well, the quick response is that the laws emerged before the state. We see this in Hayek's work, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. If you look at his distinction there between law and legislation, that's the point, one of the points of the title. He shows how, and he's among many other people, Bruce Benson, there's just Harold Berman, a lot of historians and sociologists and anthropologists have shown that law, the kind of laws you're talking about, in other words, the kind of things everybody would regard as offensive: murder, rape, torture, theft, not the kind of things the state later piles on, but the sort of the basic offenses against person and property. Those things emerge in every society. First of all, if you think about it for a second, we distinguish society from just some chaotic mob by the fact that it has a certain orderliness to it. There are ongoing relationships over a substantial period of time. That's how. So it's already the idea of law is already packed into the idea of society. You can't imagine a society without law. A society without law, we wouldn't call society. We'd really call it, a mob or a riot or chaos or something like that. The idea is already inherent there. So just as the Greeks showed, you can have moral laws, you can have morality without some, supernatural lawgiver. You can have law. These people that I've mentioned showed how you can have law, civil law, without a government lawmaker.
You wrote some time ago responding to Mitt Romney's 47% claim that 47% of people, he can't get their vote because they're so dependent on the state they'll never even listen to him. In your response, you mentioned that there is corporate welfare and that the rich are also very dependent on the state. How do you respond, or how do you explain corporate welfare to someone who just sees the state as just someone there to help the poor?
Well, you just need to look at American history and legislation on the books and day-to-day discussions in Congress. Just to pick the example from today, we have Donald Trump putting on tariffs and trade restrictions, which will be favors to certain specially appointed firms and industries like steel or aluminum, which hurts just about everybody else. Many more consumers of steel and aluminum in the United States than producers. So if you help the producers by enabling prices to be higher, which is what a tariff does, of course, consumer pays the tax ultimately, you're hurting everyone else. That's what's been called cronyism or corporatism or corporate favoritism, corporate welfare. There are a lot of outright subsidies, cash subsidies, and special sorts of tax breaks that are not available to anybody else. But a lot of it is non-cash in the form of loan guarantees, the Export-Import Bank. Tariffs is another example of a non-cash subsidy, because if the state doesn't have to give you money in order to benefit you. If it can raise your prices and restrict competition, licensing is another example. If you can restrict competition for a couple of incumbent firms, and therefore they can get higher prices, the extra money they're getting from consumers is equivalent to the government just taking it from the taxpayers and giving it to the recipients. It doesn't really matter the route You have to look at it. It's the fact that it's a government transfer, which means force is ultimately involved. The government transfer of wealth from people who own it, money, the people who own it, to people who don't have any right to it because they're not getting it through voluntary exchange.
Ralph Nader was speaking with Andrew Napolitano, and he said, say you're at a restaurant and you have some food in front of you. The average person does not have the tools to say, all right, this is healthy, this is unhealthy, this is undercooked. Doesn't the need for regulation in society justify a state and an interventionist state? How do you respond to the necessity of the state regulating the economy?
Well, the example Nader gives is pretty funny these days. I assume he said it somewhat recently, because
no, this was a while back when Andrew Napolitano was talking about his book, Lies the Government Told Me. I think it was in 2011.
Okay, 2011, that's recent enough from what I'm about to say. He says the regular person, most people, don't have the tools to see whether the food in front of them is healthy or not. That's laughable. Everybody has in their pocket or purse a smartphone these days. Everybody, just about. And so all you need to do is go online. I do it many times to see whether something I'm interested in ordering is satisfies my dietary criteria. So what's he talking about? Of course that information is available, and of course it was available before the days of the internet, but we're well into the internet age, the information age, and that information is available to everybody. So that's just a laugh. The general idea that we can't know enough so the state needs to provide this information, that really strikes at the very heart of the democratic system, which I am not a defender of, because if the people can't know enough to do those things, to manage their day-to-day lives, that's what it's really come down to. And now here I'm citing Frederick Bastiat from the early 19th century, so I'm not citing a current person. If people can't know enough to manage their own day-to-day lives, how do they know enough to elect political office holders, from the president on down to the local sheriff? I mean, it's a contradiction. Again, Bastiat pointed this out. He probably wasn't the first, but he's certainly the one I remember if you read his great little book, The Law. People are considered basically dumb until election day. Then all of a sudden, or during the election season, then they're all wise. And their selection is going to be, it's just almost mystically the result of the people being moved to make the right decision. Now, I guess some people have rethought that with Trump, perhaps, but when you think of who the other main alternative was, I'm not sure it made a big difference there. But the point is, it's incoherent. I mean, I can see saying the people are too dumb, therefore we need a dictatorship, and I'm the smart one, so make me the dictator. That's consistent. But you can't say the people are dumb, they need the government, or they're ignorant. Let's say they're dumb. Okay, they're ignorant. The knowledge is sort of beyond them, and so the government needs to guide them in all these important, sensitive things. I assume then electing office holders is not a terribly sensitive thing, because we're able to leave that to the people. It's a joke.
What is the fundamental difference between someone on the left and someone on the right?
Well, those terms now have become so muddled that I can understand people's total confusion and wanting to say, I'm beyond left and right, I'm not on the spectrum. I can totally understand that. Now, I call myself a left libertarian, along with a rather large group of my compatriots in this matter. I'll drop a few names: Gary Chartier and Roderick Long and Kevin Carson and Charles Johnson, and I could go on and on. And the reason we have chosen the word left, I think there are a bunch of reasons, and we each probably have our individual area where we would emphasize. Not that we would all disagree with the other things, but I think we would pick out our own emphasis. There was an unfortunate alliance between libertarians and conservatives during the New Deal, and then it congealed with the Cold War after World War II, because there were libertarians, of course, against communism, against Stalinism, against any kind of dictatorship, authoritarianism, or totalitarianism. But libertarians, I think, were a little too indiscriminate with whom they united. And this then caused a great deal of confusion, I think even in some libertarian minds. I don't think so much in conservative minds. They knew they weren't libertarians, but a lot of libertarians didn't realize they weren't conservatives. But in the public mind as well. So even to this day, you see libertarians, and a lot of libertarians will do this. They'll lump libertarians together with conservatives, as if to say, well, on these very broad things, there's agreement. Yeah, there's going to be some disagreement, drug laws, immigration, a few other things, but they still make it out. There's a broad agreement, sort of orientation is similar. And so I think that part of the idea of the label left libertarian is to emphasize, begin to clear up that confusion. But there's more for that. There's more behind that. Historically, there's a sort of a reason. After the French Revolution, and you have the National Assembly in France, that's where the terms left and right actually emerged. The left side, the physically right side of the assembly, of the legislature, national legislature, were the defenders of the old regime, the ones who actually wanted to restore the monarchy. On the left, you had an assortment of people who were dead against restoring the monarchy, and they looked to, broadly speaking, they were sort of liberals, and a lot of them called themselves socialists, not in the sense that they necessarily wanted the state to operate and control the means of production. They just thought that decision-making should be in the hands of society rather than the state. If you think for a second, the broad distinction within the larger society is civil society, or society for short, and the state. And I've often said that if language had worked out the way I would have preferred, the two great parties, I don't mean necessarily political parties, but the two great political philosophies would have been socialism on the one hand and statism on the other. After all, we want decision-making to be within society. By that I mean all the voluntary relationships, all the voluntary cooperation that goes on in society. The state is the arena where, formalized involuntary relationships go on. Coerced, quote, cooperation. It's not true cooperation because it's coerced. And so it is state and society. So the left were the people on the left sitting in that legislature, and then afterwards were people we would regard today as libertarians. Bastiat was a member of the legislature for a while, and he was sitting on the left, and he sat next to Joseph Proudhon, who's considered one of the first anarchists. I think he might have used the word anarchist. He has some distinction of being first person in that regard. And the left likes to claim him. The non-libertarian left also likes to claim him because he said property is theft, but that's actually a pretty complicated thing. He really meant sort of state-granted property as opposed to real property. And there were libertarians in England, like Thomas Hodgkin, who was making a similar distinction between artificial property and natural property. Artificial being state, the result of state favors. So we're just reclaiming our side on the left. Now, the libertarians of the late 19th century, early 20th century, Benjamin Tucker, the people around Liberty magazine, also regarded themselves on the left, carrying on that same tradition of Proudhon and people like that. So we are simply re-identifying with an earlier libertarian tradition in order to put the libertarian movement back in touch with what the authentic sort of original concerns were of the great radical liberal movement.
All right. I know you do a lot of writing on foreign policy, and you have some excellent conversations with Scott Horton. I'm curious what you think the motive is for terrorism against, say, Israel or the United States.
Well, I really don't think it's that difficult. It doesn't take too much reading of history to understand what's going on there. First of all, the terrorists often tell us. Somebody would have to show me why we shouldn't believe them. What they're saying is not exactly exculpatory. It doesn't really get them off the hook. They still have they've committed violence against non-combatants or just peaceful civilians. That's unjustifiable, so it doesn't exactly defend them. But they have told us repeatedly when somebody convicted of terrorism in the U.S. courts gets a chance to speak before the judge will say, do you have any words before sentencing or whatever? They always say the same thing. U.S. foreign policy, which has supported dictators in the Middle East, which has directly bombed, Muslim Arab areas, countries, societies in the Middle East, and Sport of Israel, which has subjugated the Palestinians for, well, at least 70 years. You could go back further, but let's start from, 47, 48, for 70 years. So it's very clear. Now, that doesn't mean anything somebody like that does is justifiable or excusable. If you go out and just, sort of knife a peaceful non-combatant walking down the street, I condemn that as much as I condemn, the U.S. dropping bombs on wedding parties or helping Saudi Arabia drop bombs on wedding parties in Yemen or anywhere else. So I don't mean this as we need to understand them in the sense of coddling them. We need to comprehend it. And then maybe we can address it by stop doing those things. It really doesn't make sense to say, well, if we stop doing those things, doesn't that mean the terrorists win? Those things are wrong things, the things I named just now. Those are wrong. So even if a bad person demands that you stop it, you should stop it. That's not like saying, oh, well, if you stop it, that means the bad person wins. That's ridiculous. If you're killing people, innocent people, I don't care if the worst person in the world is condemning you. You stop it. It's still bad, no matter who condemns it or doesn't condemn it. It's very simple.
Yes, I definitely agree. I would cite Bin Laden's letter to the Americans. I read that for the first time recently, and that was really eye-opening.
Yeah.
I want to read you an excerpt from the Arizona Republic on Israel-Palestine, and I want to get your response.
Sure.
Israel was given its land by the United Nations in 1948 and was satisfied with the size of the land that it was given. However, all the Arab countries attacked Israel, and in spite of the tremendous advantage in numbers and size of land, Israel defeated the whole group of them. The current so-called Palestinians were part of Jordan, which, after they left, does not want them back. Turk, the author who's being responded to, makes the statement that Israel came into Palestine in 1948 and overpowered them. He is correct about Arabs being overpowered, but only after starting the war. When you start the war and you lose, you can't expect to be back in the position you are in. The winners make the decision for all wars. How do you respond to that?
Well, to paraphrase a writer from an earlier time in the 20th century, every word of that statement is wrong, including and the. I don't know if that was a signed article. I think that person, I hope, had the guts to put his or her name on it. Everything about that is wrong. First of all, let's start with the very first statement. The UN gave this land to somebody. I recommend everybody look up Jeremy R. Hammond's very good essay, The Myth of the UN Creation of Israel. The United Nations has zero power in its bylaws, whatever they call their governing documents, to create countries or to take land that's attached or part of one territory and give it to another group of people and saying, okay, you now have a country. It has zero power for that. And if you go back and read what the UN did in November of 1947, it recommended, and that's the key word, it recommended partition. And it recommended it to the Security Council. No, the Security Council didn't have any way to carry that out either. But they were contending with the problem that was going on because the British were leaving Palestine. They had a mandate ever since World War II to run Palestine basically as a colony. But there was violence, and they were getting attacked by Israeli or Zionist terrorists. But the Arabs weren't too happy about them being there either. And so they finally said, we give up, and they threw it into the lap of the new United Nations. Don't forget, the United Nations really had just been set up. So it was a recommendation. It did not create a state, and it wouldn't have had the power to say to the Palestinians, we're taking some of your land, and we're going to give it to this group that calls themselves Zionists, who want to have this homeland, as the Balfour Declaration put it in 1917, 30 years earlier, this homeland, in Palestine. Okay, so that's the first wrong statement. Didn't create the state of Israel. The second wrong statement it makes is, I got to remember it now. You want to repeat the second sentence to me?
The second statement is, however, all the Arab countries attacked Israel.
Yeah. Well, before that, it said Israel was satisfied. No, I think that was the next statement. Israel was satisfied, or the people that would then become, the government of the state of Israel, wasn't Israel yet, were satisfied. That's wrong. They were not satisfied. Now, even though the UN partition would have assigned, it had been carried out, 56% of Palestine. In other words, the land south of Syria and east of the Mediterranean Sea and west of the Jordan River, above Egypt and above Saudi Arabia. That's what I'm calling Palestine here. That was the mandate, basically, under Britain. It gave the Jew, they simply called them the Jews, 56%. They were not anywhere near a majority of the people of Palestine. The Arabs, both, and by the way, when I say Arabs, keep in mind, these were not sort of pure Arabs. These were people who were there. These were the descendants of people who were there from biblical times, from pre-Joshua times, before he conquers Jericho and wipes out a whole bunch of people. These are people who were there continuously, and then of course it was conquered many times over history. So there's always mixing, right? So these aren't, well, my point is they're not just pure Arabs. These were not purely the descendants of people who came from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th or 8th century and conquered the Holy Land. These are also people, a mixture of people who were there before there was even a Jewish religion. So just to make it clear. They were a majority of Palestine. And so the UN resolution, the recommendation, gerrymandered things to try to come up with a crazy shaped area that would have a majority of Jews. And it was hard to do because, like I said, the Christians and the Muslims, the Palestinians, I'll call them Palestinians now, although there were Jewish Palestinians who had lived there for a long time. But the Christian and Muslim Palestinians were the overwhelming majority. And so they had to come up with this territory that was 56% in order to get a bare majority of Jews in that defined area. So first of all, why are the Jews, who are a minority in the whole area, getting a majority of the land and some of the best land? Galilee and some other places, not all of the Galilee, but so yes, they accepted it. But it's very clear from the writings of Ben Gurion and the other leading leaders of the future state, in their diaries, in their memoirs. They all wrote biographies. Lots of letters have been published. Government documents have been opened up since the 80s. The Israeli government, the military, they only bought it to get their foot in the door. Ben Gurion's quite clear about this. They said, we'll take this, but this isn't the end of it. We will declare our borders. And when they declared independence, this is what got things going. When they declared independence, 6 months or so after the resolution by the UN, they did not define their borders in the Declaration of Independence, because they knew this was not the end. And by the time that war was over, instead of having the 56%, they had much more. After 67, of course, they had about 80%. I mean, they had the whole thing. Sorry, with the West Bank and Gaza being about 22%. So they enlarged. You can find the series of maps online. Just Google maps of Palestine, Israel, and you'll see the progress, or I want to call it progress, from what the UN recommended to what happened in 48, 49, and then what happened in 67. It's growing. The Jewish-controlled area, the Zionist-controlled area, the Israeli-controlled area, whatever you want to call it, grew and grew and grew. So there was not a satisfaction. Now, the next point this person makes is that the Arabs didn't accept it. The Palestinians were never even brought into the consultations by the powers, the committees, the UN committees that were doing this. They were shut out from the beginning. And this is symptomatic of how the British were treating the Arabs ever since they promised them independence in 1916, 1917, during World War II. They said, if you revolt against the Turks, because the Turks were on the Germany and Austria side in the war, World War I, they said, if you revolt against the Turks, helping us, the British and the French, in our war, we will give you independence after the war. Well, they had no intention of keeping that promise. At the very same time, they made promises to the British and the Zionist organizations that we look with favor upon a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which is something, if the Arabs had known in advance about that, they would have been extremely unhappy, because they're making contradictory promises. So the Arabs were not consulted, they were not brought in, but specifically the Palestinians, because you could say, well, why should the other Arab countries be involved? We're talking about Palestine, but of course they had an interest in it. They were interested in it, but the Palestinians themselves, the people on the scene, the local people, were just they were regarded as the non-Jewish communities, right? If you read the Balfour Declaration, there's this throwaway line about establishing this Jewish home shall not prejudice the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, which is pretty odd. They're the majority, and that they're just simply being called the non-Jewish communities, as if it's already a Jewish area and there's maybe a couple pockets of non-Jewish communities, instead of it being the other way around. So that statement is wrong. The Arabs didn't want to accept it, because it's like if a thief breaks into your house and has grabbed your silver and says, okay, look, here you go, I'll leave you 44% of your silver. If you don't accept that, are you being uncooperative and intractable? No, of course not. You object to the theft, and the Palestinians objected to the theft of their land. That land was acquired through conquest, through purchases from absentee landlords, and they kicked off the peasants, the tillers of the soil, the farmers that worked it, and whose families had been there, for more than 1,000 years. And so, of course, they weren't happy about that. And so that's the standard version that you read, but that is wrong in every respect.
You wrote 2 articles praising Murray Rothbard on his book Ethics of Liberty and For a New Liberty. Yep. I'm wondering what the most important thing you learned from Murray Rothbard was.
Well, that would take a half an hour itself. I learned much about Murray Rothbard. He was one of my early influences, and I learned a great deal about natural law and what natural law actually means. I learned about markets, how markets work. He was one of my sort of introductions to the Austrian School of Economics, which I still believe is the best description of how markets and voluntary societies work. I think what I particularly commented on in those 2 articles was his strategic insights about how you can be radical, you can be an anarchist, but that doesn't, and you can be an abolitionist, because he was very much influenced by William Lloyd Garrison and the other abolitionists. But that doesn't mean you're expecting the state, tomorrow to disappear. And so you can fight for lesser measures in the meantime, while still holding out this ultimate destination of a stateless society. So I've learned a huge amount from him in many ways.
All right, and final question for you: if there was one book you could recommend to everyone in the world to read, what book would that be?
Oh my! You should have given me advanced warning on this question. I would have thought about it overnight. Only one book. What should it be? Oh gosh, you really need to give me a warning. Can I say a couple?
Yeah.
I mean, as a quick read, just to give you sort of orientation here, I would recommend Bastiat's The Law. I think it's a great little start. It's a very thin book. It won't take you long. You can find it online. When you have to pay for it. As far as this orientation goes, what it's all about. Oh my gosh. I'm drawing a blank because it's such a big question. I would recommend looking at material by Gary Chartier, and I mean, go online. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be a series of articles. Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard it's a big book, but it's a readable book on economics, but also on the free society more generally. But even though it's strictly economics, The Road to Serfdom is a very good start by Hayek, written during World War II. And so I hope that gives you some sense. I know after we hang up, I'm going to be thinking, why didn't I say this? Why didn't I say that? I mean, yeah, you got to give a warning on a question like that. It's a wonderful question, but I should have, I needed more time to think about it.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
All right.
I got a good couple titles off there. I got a few out there, so that's at least I didn't draw a total blank.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to those who took the time to watch this. A lot of important topics, I feel. Thank you very much, Mr. Richman.
I enjoy it. Talk to you again.